Most UFO sightings are dismissed because there's no physical proof. Joe Simontton's case from 1961 stood apart. He was left holding something he could touch, taste, and hand over for testing. This wasn't a distant light in the sky. It was food, a pancake. Back then, samples moved from a local judge to NIKAP, the FDA, and Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. In this video, we'll revisit those original lab findings, the Air Force files, overlooked eyewitness accounts, and the new analyses now being circulated today. To understand how it began, we need to return to that cold Wisconsin morning. The encounter that shocked Eagle River. The story that would come to define Eagle River began with an ordinary man. Joe Simontton was 54 years old, a part-time plumber who also raised chickens on his small Wisconsin property. On the morning of April 18, 1961, he stepped outside to start his day. Nothing about the weather or the quiet in town hinted at what was about to occur. Yet it was this morning that placed him at the center of one of the most unusual and contested encounters in UFO history. Before we continue, one quick clarification about naming. In the records, both Simontton and Simon appear. Most of the official documents, including Project Blue Book files, use Simontton. To avoid confusion, this video will use the name Simontton, while acknowledging that variant does exist in the sources. According to Simontton's later statement, a disc-shaped craft about 30 feet across and 12 feet high descended into his backyard. It settled without sound, hovering a short distance above the ground. The surface shimmered metallic, smooth, and seamless. It was clearly built, but its sudden appearance defied any aircraft Simontton had ever seen. Airplanes or helicopters could be heard long before arrival. This object had arrived in silence and composure. A hatch at the side already stood open. From it, Simontton saw 3 occupants, each roughly 5 feet tall. They looked proportionally human, moving in coordinated motions like people habitually working together inside a confined space. One gestured toward Simontton, holding something shaped like a container. By the gesture and context, he understood it to be a request for water. He carried the container back into his kitchen, filled it from the tap, and returned. The interaction contained no threat, no outburst of sound or light, just a simple request fulfilled. After he handed it back, the figure inside turned to what looked like a flat grill-like surface without any visible flames. The occupant worked over it with deliberate movements, producing flat, round cakes. Moments later, one of these was handed out to Simontton. The exchange was both strange and strangely ordinary. Visitors bearing technology far beyond anything in Eagle River had traded him food. The product looked much like a pancake a neighbor might fry on a skillet. Facing this, Simontton did what he often did with food: he tasted it. Later he would describe it plainly. The texture was coarse and the flavor resembled cardboard. However unremarkable the taste, its significance lay elsewhere. Unlike lights in the night sky, here was something that could be touched and tested. As Simontton still held one of the cakes, the encounter neared its end. The hatch closed smoothly until the seam vanished entirely. With a sharp tilt, about 45 degrees, the craft accelerated upward and was gone. No smoke, no roaring engines, and no remaining marks in the ground were left behind. Only the pancakes remained in Simontton's hand. Soon after, neighbors and townspeople would hear his account, and he was not the only one to describe activity that day. Within the same hour, Savino Borgo and members of the Loretsky family each reported seeing metallic discs or anomalous lights in the surrounding area. Whether related or not, the timing gave Simontton's story a degree of corroboration missing from most single-witness reports. For Eagle River, the details transformed the sighting from anecdote to tangible puzzle. What had landed in Simontton's yard was said to leave no damage, no noise, and no visible fuel system. What its occupants had left behind could be handled, seen, and even tasted by others. The absurdity of alien pancakes was easy fodder for jokes, but dismissing them entirely was not so simple, because they were physically there. Investigators immediately recognized how rare this situation was. Historian and astronomer J. Allen Hynek, acting as a consultant for the Air Force's Project Blue Book, visited Eagle River himself. He interviewed Simontton in person, collected statements, and confirmed that the cakes had been retained as evidence. Hynek's report noted all the peculiar elements: craft dimensions, the hatch that sealed without seams, the 3 short occupants, the odd cooking process, and Simontton's description of the taste. In his notes, he judged Simontton sincere, even if the story defied expectations. Skeptics drew attention to the practical oddities. If beings had the capacity to cross interplanetary distances, why would they need tap water from a farmhouse? Why produce food familiar in shape to human breakfasts? These questions circulated, but they did not erase the fact that the cakes existed, could be photographed, and could be tested in labs. That set the case apart from vague reports of lights or fleeting visions. When townspeople visited, some laughed while holding one of the strange cakes, but they were still handling the very item Simontton claimed to have received from the craft. That physicality forced even the most doubtful to admit they were dealing with more than story alone. Whether a prank, an unexplained phenomenon, or something unheard of, there was no avoiding its reality as an artifact. For that reason, the Air Force and other authorities paid close attention. The encounter carried all the hallmarks of a case study: daylight visibility, a direct interaction, and most crucially, surviving material evidence. Unlike many reports that lived and died in word of mouth, this one produced an object that could move from kitchen to court desk, from town to federal files. By the end of that day, the mystery extended beyond Simontton's quiet backyard. He now held in his possession food said to originate from a craft unlike any conventional aircraft, and word of it spread quickly through Eagle River. The object that began as a simple trade, water for pancakes, would push its way into official investigations and eventually into the halls of scientific scrutiny. What remained in question was not only the correctness of Simontton's perception, but the chain of custody that followed. Once his neighbors and local officials pressed for closer inspection, those small cakes would leave his table behind and enter the realm of laboratories, files, and skepticism. And in that passage, the so-called space pancakes would find themselves weighed on scales, crushed under instruments, and dissected in search of an answer. Pancakes under the microscope. Once the cakes left Joe Simontton's farmhouse, their fate quickly became a matter of record. Within days, he carried one of them to the Vilas County Courthouse, where Judge Frank W. Carter agreed to take possession. Carter realized that, however unremarkable the item looked, it carried national attention. On April 21, 1961, Carter forwarded a sample to the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, or NIKAP, the country's leading civilian UFO research group at the time. That marked the start of an official paper trail. NIKAP's interest was immediate, but their approach was cautious. Correspondence in April and May of 1961 shows internal hesitation. Members agreed that if analyzed improperly, the case could be written off as a hoax or, worse for their credibility, as a publicity stunt. Rather than publish their involvement, they referred the matter to outside scientists. In May 1961, NIKAP's Richard Hall reported that efforts were underway to identify a laboratory willing to test the sample. Letters between NIKAP associates, including Professor Alan Meltzer and Walter Manny, document the struggle. Finding an analyst ready to work on alien pancakes was not straightforward in that era. By early June, the Food and Drug Administration had formally agreed to evaluate the material. On June 8, 1961, FDA chemists issued their report. The sample contained buckwheat hulls, wheat bran, starch, and soybean hulls. No toxic or unknown chemicals were detected. The language was dry and matter-of-fact. Far from exotic alloys or rare isotopes, the pancakes broke down into the same components one could have purchased from a local mill. Yet the presence of buckwheat, not a staple in Simontton's kitchen and uncommon in local farming at the time, raised small questions that the FDA did not address. Meanwhile, the Air Force's Project Blue Book took notice. Major Hector Quintanilla and later Major Robert Friend passed along interest to astronomer J. Allen Hynek, already a consultant for the Air Force. Hynek traveled to Wisconsin, interviewed Simontton directly, and confirmed that multiple fragments of the cakes remained in circulation. Eventually, samples reached the Air Technical Intelligence Center, ATIC, at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, though no additional tests beyond the FDA's were ever made public. In the Blue Book files, one entry simply marked the case as explained pancake hoax, with little elaboration beyond that bureaucratic dismissal. So the investigative arc unfolded in 5 clear steps. Simontton handed the cakes to Judge Carter. Carter sent them to NIKAP. NIKAP secured analysis by the FDA on June 8. The results pointed to ordinary grains, and Hynek conveyed samples to the Air Force, where they were filed and effectively shelved. This was not an open mystery circulating without context. The chain of custody is documented, even if the final conclusions were unsatisfying. The findings on the surface were enough for skeptics. Composition of wheat, starch, and buckwheat made the event little more than culinary folklore, but each link in the chain held its complications. NIKAP did not outright dismiss the case, though they kept their distance. Scientists and correspondents admitted reluctance, not due to the sample's danger, but due to its association with UFO lore. For them, the problem was credibility, not chemistry. At the same time, Simontton's testimony underlined that he never claimed the cakes were made from alien elements. From the beginning, he maintained only that visitors gave him cooked food. In that sense, the FDA's results aligned with his story rather than undermined it. The cakes were food, just as he had described. The question was not whether they were edible grains, but whether grains of that character could have plausibly originated in his household. As the years passed, surviving portions of the cakes resurfaced in scattered archives. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, private correspondence hints that fragments changed hands among collectors and researchers. By the 1990s, some samples entered universities for occasional study, though without consistent documentation. One such inquiry came from chemist Alexander McBain, who examined carbon isotope values of the preserved cakes. His conclusion was cautious. The values were fairly close to average environmental carbon, meaning they fit within normal terrestrial ranges. McBain's analysis implied no extraordinary signature, but it also reminded newer generations that the samples themselves had not been destroyed. More recently, claims of new studies have circulated in 2025. Reports, though still preliminary, suggest that isotope ratio mass spectrometry and electron imaging may reveal deviations not accounted for in earlier technology. At present, however, these assertions remain early claims. Unless tied directly to named laboratory reports or peer-reviewed memos, they must be treated as provisional. The only officially published and historically verifiable results remain those of June 8, 1961, where the FDA named buckwheat, soybean hulls, wheat bran, and starch as the components. This contrast between what was documented in 1961 and what is now being whispered about in 2025 illustrates the core tension of the case. Officially, what sits in the record looks unremarkable. Unofficially, questions about origins, isotopes, and preparation methods continue to circulate because no analysis has ever fully explained how Simontton came by the cakes in the first place. The chain of custody is clear, the chemistry is familiar, but the context remains unresolved. What cannot be ignored is how rapidly the Air Force, NIKAP, and the local court all shifted responsibility. Each passed the sample to the next body, as though no institution wanted to be the one left holding an alien pancake. The episode demonstrates the discomfort between UFO reports and scientific institutions at the time. The data were simple, the story was complex. And so the record of the pancakes closes, at least in the historical files, with an ambiguous stamp. They were analyzed, sorted, and then set aside, yet the story surrounding them refused to end. For in Eagle River that same day, Simontton was not the only one pointing skyward. Others reported unusual objects, lights, and disks in the same region, observations that would later slip into the margins of local papers but not into the official files. It is those missing voices, the townspeople who also claim to have seen something, that complicate the picture left by the laboratories. While the pancakes went under the microscope, the sky itself was also drawing attention. Witnesses history almost forgot. In the aftermath of Joe Simontton's encounter, it turned out he was not the only resident of northern Wisconsin reporting something unusual in April 1961. Several overlooked witnesses described metallic objects in the same time frame, yet their voices largely disappeared from the official record. These forgotten accounts provide context, suggesting that Simontton's story was not an isolated tale of a lone farmer, but part of a brief cluster of sightings that history almost erased. Some of those names can still be traced in contemporary sources. Savino Borgo told the Milwaukee Sentinel he saw a metallic disc rise diagonally into the sky around the same time Simontton reported his own sighting. The family of Mrs. Loretsky described a disc-like object during the evening of April 27, less than 2 weeks later, again near Eagle River. Mrs. Paul Cooper even filed a report with NIKAP, noting that she had seen a rotating bright object and later realized her description matched details circulating in town. Taken together, these voices offer something that Project Blue Book never emphasized: a local cluster of disc sightings corroborating one another within days of Simontton's encounter. These reports did not appear in the national UFO files. Instead, they trickled through small-town newsletters, side columns of local papers, or remained locked in memory. The Simontton pancakes commanded attention precisely because physical evidence could be carried into labs, but the surrounding eyewitnesses lacked tangible proof. As a result, their accounts faded into obscurity, overlooked by the very institutions that might have confirmed that more than one person in Eagle River had witnessed something in April 1961. That omission reshaped the case in ways still felt today. The national press that swarmed Eagle River after the pancake story broke focused almost entirely on the bizarre details of alien cooking. Judge Frank Carter found himself inundated with calls from journalists across the country, and wire services delighted in treating Simontton as an eccentric curiosity. Sightings from neighbors and motorists rarely made it beyond private retellings. The human tendency to spotlight the strangest detail, pancakes allegedly served by a spacecraft, allowed quieter corroborations to slip below the surface. But those accounts align with a consistent pattern. Families driving home from church that day reported a hovering disc above the tree line. A father initially assumed it was a military helicopter, until the craft's uniform reflections and seamless shape suggested otherwise. The children who watched remembered it rocking in the air before darting away at an unnatural speed. On nearby farms, men tending fields during that week told neighbors about solid metallic shapes crossing silently against the wind. One described a disc that skimmed low and then climbed vertically out of view. Motorists provided similar stories. At least 3 separate drivers recalled stopping to watch sunlight flashing off something metallic above the horizon. In each case, the object vanished quickly, and most kept quiet afterward, wary of ridicule. Unlike Simontton, these witnesses had no artifact to present. Without a tangible object, their testimony carried little weight, and community gossip remained their only record. Project Blue Book itself reinforced that bias. The program generally judged cases by whether multiple witnesses filed direct statements or physical artifacts existed. Single observer encounters and landings rarely received sustained analysis. J. Allen Hynek, who interviewed Simontton on behalf of the Air Force, acknowledged this tendency in his later writing. Without corroborating written testimony, landing reports were seldom prioritized. That systemic approach explains why the Borgo, Loretsky, and Cooper accounts never meaningfully entered official files. Even though taken together, they weaken the narrative of Joe Simontton as a solitary witness. The result was a skewed portrait. National UFO organizations and the Air Force distilled Eagle River down to one strange exchange between a farmer and a flying saucer. The broader context that multiple individuals independently described discs or metallic craft during the same week was never incorporated. In effect, the surrounding support structure was stripped away, leaving Simontton's report exposed, appearing eccentric when it may in fact have been a central piece in a regional wave. Modern researchers, revisiting the primary materials, find themselves reconstructing the forgotten parts through microfilm newspaper clippings, community notes, and oral recollections. The consistency is clear: metallic disc shapes, daylight sightings, motion that did not resemble airplanes, and silence where engines should have been. Simontton's story stands out for its interaction, but the others confirm the presence of something beyond routine. The difference lies in what each witness saw. Joe received food, the rest observed from a distance, but both experiences point toward an anomaly. The larger question is why these accounts were not considered in official evaluations. The probable answer lies in institutional priorities. Incorporating several overlapping narratives would have complicated closure. Case files could not neatly describe Eagle River as a hoax or misidentified balloon if multiple witnesses outside Joe's household backed elements of his story. By trimming those corroborations, officials simplified the narrative and could mark it, explain. For them, the burden of excess testimony outweighed the benefits. Despite the neglect, the forgotten witnesses remain crucial for understanding how the community itself experienced that week. For many residents, Simontton's claim did not feel completely absurd, because neighbors and motorists were privately sharing their own sightings of silent disc-like craft. The story played out not as a lone eccentric telling wild tales, but as one small town experiencing several points of strangeness. Families talked about it over dinners. Farmers in passing conversations mentioned odd low-flying objects, and townspeople debated whether tap water and pancakes could truly link back to otherworldly visitors. What emerges then is not a single isolated episode, but a local wave. Dozens may not have spoken formally, but the few names preserved, Borgo, the Loretskys, Mrs. Paul Cooper, demonstrate a range of backgrounds and locations, all aligning in time. Eagle River was not simply the site of one eccentric sighting, but a temporary locus of activity that, had it been examined more carefully, might have told a different story. Remembering those nearly lost accounts shifts the framing of Simontton's claim. Instead of standing alone, tested only against his personal honesty, his testimony aligns with a broader picture of discs described by others the very same week. This convergence challenges the caricature that history later produced, the farmer with alien pancakes. Instead, it points toward a community collectively brushing against the unexplained, even if only one man interacted directly. For researchers today, the task is not only to analyze what was written in official files, but also to recover what was left out. In doing so, patterns grow clearer and formerly absurd claims gain context. While the Air Force moved quickly to shelve the pancakes under Hoax, the residents of Eagle River quietly remembered metallic discs at low altitude, seen in daylight, described by unrelated people. These memories, scattered across small records, paint a fuller image of what 1961 looked like in northern Wisconsin. The larger issue now rests in interpretation. To fairly judge Simontton's claim, one must also account for the wave of sightings that surrounded him. If he invented his story wholesale, then several neighbors coincidentally described very similar metallic craft in the same window of time. That coincidence strains belief, suggesting that what happened on April 18th was connected to something real in the skies. And while those skies are often dismissed as cloudy with confusion or faulty perception, the actual atmospheric conditions of that day reveal a different picture. 1961 weather conditions reconstructed. On the question of whether poor visibility could have influenced what Joe Simontton claimed to see, the surviving records give a consistent answer. J. Allen Hynek, who visited Eagle River shortly after the event on behalf of Project Blue Book, noted in his handwritten field report that the weather was clear and the sun was shining the morning of April 18, 1961. The official Blue Book case summary also mentions clear conditions, which means the encounter did not occur against a background of haze, mist, or fog. In other words, Simontton was not watching through layers of atmospheric distortion, but under straightforward skies. That detail may sound minor, but it weakens several of the more common explanations that have been raised. Arguments involving shimmering mirages, unusual reflections, or thermal illusions generally rely on unstable air or moist haze scattering light. Clear, calm spring skies make such distorting effects much less likely. Hynek's note also confirms that the sun was visible, which suggests a solidly lit scene instead of half glimpses in dim twilight. For an observer accustomed to identifying passing aircraft in the usual sights of rural Wisconsin, these conditions would only make details sharper. Some modern researchers have gone further by reviewing digitized copies of local surface logs preserved by NOAA. When those temperature, wind, and barometric records are charted, they align with Hynek's description of a cool, dry mid-morning under high-pressure stability. This retrospective validation does not radically change the picture, but it provides stronger footing for what was already stated in primary sources. The view from Joe's yard was unobstructed, and there is little evidence of natural distortion. Clarity alone does not resolve what occurred. A clear sky does not prove that the disk Simontton described was what he believed it to be, nor does it provide confirmation of extraordinary origins. What it does is reduce the number of plausible scenarios tied to optical error. Critics who maintain that he could have confused a weather balloon or atmospheric reflection with a structured craft must also contend with contemporaneous station data showing few opportunities for such illusions. Blue Book files themselves included the weather balloon possibility, but regional launch records place no releases in range of Eagle River during that morning. The alternative explanations are not eliminated, they just rest more on speculation than on environmental support. The same logic applies to suggestions about aircraft. Traffic in Wisconsin was not high that morning, and official site visits made it clear there were no reports of helicopters or low-flying jets in Eagle River at the relevant time. Combined with clear weather, this does not disprove the hypothesis of misidentification, but it emphasizes that a lifetime resident like Simontton, familiar with seasonal flights and reflective planes, would not easily confuse one hovering at close range with a silent metallic disk on the ground. The conditions heightened rather than hindered his ability to make that distinction. For investigators in 1961, the absence of poor weather also mattered because it undercut one of their most convenient fallback positions. In many reports, they could attribute sightings to stars twinkling through thin clouds, planets seen between haze, or mirages heightened by heat. At Eagle River, none of those factors provided a serious anchor. Hynek's own careful description, he did not embellish, simply writing about clear skies and a bright sun, makes evident that he recognized this. If Simontton had been confused, it would not have been due to fog, rain, or optical trickery stemming from the weather. Placing this into context with the broader case, the environmental clarity intersects directly with another unusual factor, the tangible artifact. Normally, UFO cases lean heavily on whether witnesses truly recognized what they saw. Any slip in conditions gives skeptics an easy path to claim mistakes. In this instance, that line of attack loses strength because the physical evidence shifts credibility thresholds and the weather did not provide distortive cover. Together, these facts elevate what would otherwise have been easy to dismiss. It is useful to recall that Project Blue Book treated weather references as side notes more than essential data points, but later assessment shows they carry disproportionate weight. A single sentence in a field notebook, whether clear, sun shining, has implications that ripple across the viability of entire categories of mundane explanations. This small confirmation made the Eagle River case harder to set aside cleanly, even though the final Blue Book summary did so without extended discussion. From today's standpoint, the reconstructed meteorological context does not solve the mystery, but it does frame it differently. Simontton described metallic surfaces, a hatch, and occupants. These details cannot be written off as tricks of glare the way they could in other cases. Clear conditions mean his account stands or falls on other grounds: credibility, interpretation, or fabrication. The weather neither proves the extraordinary nor produces the ordinary explanation. Instead, it removes one of the easiest escape routes. That absence of environmental excuses would soon force investigators to focus elsewhere. If conditions offered no support for optical illusions, then explanations had to take solid form, whether labeling the pancakes as a prank, questioning Simontton's sincerity, or suggesting that the objects had a terrestrial origin not yet identified. In the months and years that followed, much of that narrative played out in official paperwork, where judgments were issued and labels of probable hoax were applied. Yet, as later evidence shows, those official lines did not always match the private doubts circulating inside the very agencies making them. It is within those institutional records, held quietly for decades and only in recent years released, that a different picture begins to appear. The Air Force's declassified doubts. When Eagle River entered the Air Force's system in 1961, what emerged in the official record sounded clean and certain. Project Blue Book filed the case summary quickly, labeling Joe Simontton's account a hallucination and implying that the pancake samples were ordinary food not worthy of further notice. Yet surrounding correspondence from that spring and summer shows a more complicated story. The organizations involved did not treat the matter lightly, even if the final statement to the public made it sound trivial. The surviving letters and complaint notes reveal hesitation, caution, and even unease about how to categorize what had happened. The chain began with Judge Frank W. Carter, who received one of Simontton's cakes directly and tried to shepherd it into proper channels. In his correspondence, Carter pressed for clarity about who exactly analyzed the material. When he forwarded it through the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, NIKAP, officials there made clear their reluctance to be directly tied to publicity. Richard Hall of NIKAP wrote that the organization would be extremely skeptical of the case and advised avoiding any action that might embarrass them if the event proved fraudulent. That caution was striking, given that UFO advocacy groups usually pushed for greater attention. In this instance, the leadership treated the evidence as a burden that needed careful distancing. Carter himself grew frustrated. He wrote asking for the name of the chemist responsible for the analysis, a request that reflected his desire for certainty. Instead, the responses he received were partial and delayed. The Food and Drug Administration finally returned an analysis on June 8, 1961, listing wheat bran, soybean hulls, buckwheat hulls, and starch as the constituents. Those results, while definitive on paper, did not resolve Carter's concerns about process. His questions highlight a tension. The legal official who started the chain of custody wanted concrete accountability, while the groups around him closed ranks to keep the incident contained. At nearly the same moment, the Air Force reached its own decision. In Hynek's field visit, he examined Eagle River firsthand, interviewed Simontton, and recorded impressions of clear weather and a sincere witness. His private notes did not call Joe a liar, nor did they accuse him of staging the food. Instead, Blue Book's final card labeled the matter a misunderstanding, even going so far as to chalk it up to hallucination. That verdict contradicted the impression Hynek made in his interview, and it illustrates the divide between what was written internally by those visiting the site and what was stamped for the official file. The cancellation of ambiguity seems deliberate. Publicly, Air Force representatives leaned into ridicule by categorizing Simontton's account as an eccentric tale. Internally, the investigators were more circumspect. Hynek noted details carefully: dimensions of the craft, the behavior of the occupants, the mechanics of the hatch closing. None of that suggested delusion in his notebook. The FDA analysis, likewise, did not declare fraud. It identified ordinary components but avoided speculating about why such foods would appear in Simontton's yard. The flattening into hallucination on the case card looks less like a conclusion and more like a choice to simplify. And NIKAP's stance reinforces this reading. Their May 9, 1961, correspondence explicitly rejected bringing publicity to the case. This decision reveals institutional self-protection. They were not eager to explain away the event entirely, but neither were they prepared to champion it. In context, that was because the case was too strange to promote and too well documented to ignore. To them, defending it risked reputational damage. Dismissing it outright risked alienating Carter and other interested parties. The resulting position was quiet management: archive it, note doubts, and avoid headlines. The divergence of voices becomes sharper when placed side by side. Official public verdicts, hallucination, hoax, trivial food sample. Private and peripheral voices, cautious, skeptical, but still engaged enough to request names of analysts and precise methods. Between these poles, the evidence drifted into obscurity. While the Air Force preserved samples and filed documents, the rhetoric available to newspapers was crafted to make the incident look absurd. Pancakes from a flying saucer invited laughter, and that laughter served institutions well. For modern readers, the lesson is how the dismissal operated. The Simontton case was not written off because the evidence had no chain of custody. Carter ensured a direct pathway to agencies. It was not written off because laboratories found chemicals inconsistent with food. The FDA found normal ingredients, but nothing false about their presence. What drove the public hallucination label was something else: the need to undercut the cultural risk of associating official studies with food allegedly offered by non-human visitors. The ridicule factor outweighed the nuance in laboratory reports or field notes. Researchers piecing through archives today point out the irony. In a situation where the Air Force had tangible material and a detailed report, its official words became blunter than the private documents. Hynek's careful account of Simontton's sincerity vanished from summaries. Carter's insistence on accountability evaporated into silence. NIKAP's hedging letters, written to protect the group, left behind a trail of unease that the public never saw. This juxtaposition creates the doubt, now visible not through invented later files, but through the authentic 1961 correspondence that paints a texture more complex than a one-word dismissal. The core contradiction emerges from that texture. On paper, for the public eye, it was a hallucination. In letters and notes, it was a problem to be managed, too strange to trust yet too specific to erase completely. Both the Air Force and civilian organizations chose to put the weight of certainty in their outward language while clutching uncertainty inside their working correspondence. That divergence illustrates not conspiracy in the dramatic sense, but the everyday institutional instinct to simplify complicated evidence for consumption beyond professional circles. Even without modern reinterpretations, the 1961 records suffice to show that the institutions involved were not at ease. Hynek refrained from accusing Joe of fabrication. Carter asked for names and processes, signaling dissatisfaction. NIKAP's Richard Hall recommended skepticism, but avoided asserting fraud. Each piece adds to a picture of reluctance rather than closure. The eventual classification of hallucination worked as a barrier, not a mirror of what insiders were recording. This dynamic explains how ridicule was institutionalized. By highlighting only the strangest element, the pancake exchange, the Air Force rendered the case unserious in public discourse. But the surviving documents remind us that those within the process did not laugh so easily. They might not have concluded otherworldly origin, but they also did not fully buy the narrative they were instructed to project. That ambivalence, more than the flour and buckwheat results, is what lingers in the declassified record. For contemporary viewers, these subtleties reframe the case. The Air Force was not monolithic in its judgment. Its public summaries functioned as a shield, while its internal mechanics betrayed unresolved concern. Knowing that distinction matters for evaluating UFO history, it demonstrates how much of the official record was shaped less by data and more by perceptions of credibility, ridicule, and reputation. And yet, beneath those layers of management, one fact remained consistent. Food had been presented, tested, and preserved. Whatever one thought of the explanation, the pancakes existed. That brute reality resisted headline dismissal, even as the institutions attempted to sideline the witness who handed them over. As researchers return to the case now, the question naturally arises: if these cakes really did come from visitors, why did they resemble buckwheat pancakes at all? Understanding why something so ordinary could serve as evidence for something extraordinary is the next puzzle. The science of alien food in 2025. If scientists are asked to consider food as potential evidence, the only way forward is to focus on what can actually be measured. That question, what science can and cannot tell us about the so-called space pancakes, has shaped the debate since 1961. What looked like an everyday breakfast carried weight precisely because it existed in physical form, but when placed under analysis, the story narrowed to two documented results: the Food and Drug Administration's laboratory report from June 8, 1961, and a later isotopic chart published by chemist Alexander McBain. The FDA's findings were straightforward. The agency's chemists broke the sample down and identified buckwheat hulls, wheat bran, soybean hulls, and starch. Nothing toxic, nothing exotic, nothing that hinted at chemical engineering beyond ordinary agriculture. In the narrowest sense, their conclusion aligned with the appearance and taste Simontton described was food made of grains. Yet the existence of buckwheat raised mild questions, because Simontton himself did not keep buckwheat in his kitchen, and it was not a dominant crop in that corner of Wisconsin at the time. The report did not comment on sourcing, only on contents. Decades later, McBain's study added one more layer. He reviewed the carbon isotope values embedded in the samples, a method that had gained strength in geochemistry by the 1960s. His results were cautious. The isotopic ratios appeared fairly close to average values for environmental carbon. In other words, the cakes did not show radical deviations. They sat within the expected range one would associate with terrestrial crops. McBain did not claim alien origin. He did not claim fabrication either. His language emphasized that nothing in the isotope stood out as dramatically abnormal. Those two details, the FDA's ingredient list and McBain's isotope graph, are the only publicly documented scientific conclusions known today. Many secondary sources over the years have exaggerated or speculated beyond what the data actually showed. They suggested strange environments, cosmic radiation signatures, even meteoritic fingerprints. Yet the verifiable evidence preserved in the record does not go that far. What it does provide is a baseline. The pancakes were real edible products, tested as containing earthly grains and bearing isotopes that did not break from normal environmental values. From there, the conversation shifts to what modern methods might be able to detect. Since the 1960s, tools like isotope ratio mass spectrometry and trace element mapping have become more precise, allowing scientists to distinguish crop origins down to the regional soil or fertilizer type. Applied to any plant-based material, these methods can reveal subtle differences that earlier analysts could not measure. A loaf of bread made in one valley may show chemical signatures distinct from bread baked with flour grown hundreds of miles away. When researchers today look back at the Simontton sample, the question is whether those fragments still exist in sufficient condition for reanalysis. Archival evidence suggests some slivers were preserved in private collections, university archives, and possibly even official stores. If they surface, science in 2025 could certainly probe much deeper than scientists did in 1961. That said, until a new and properly published study appears, the standing record remains McBain's cautious average values and the FDA's list of grains. Anything more than that requires documentary proof, not speculation. This is where the story again intersects with the culture around UFO research. For decades, enthusiasts and skeptics alike have debated why a pancake without pausing to ground their arguments in the modest data actually available. Nutritional symbolism, cultural communication, a gesture of reciprocity. All these ideas orbit the case because hard science had little more to say beyond buckwheat, wheat, soybean, starch. The pancakes became a canvas for conjecture because the measured facts were too ordinary to satisfy a mystery. Symbolic possibilities nevertheless matter. If one interprets the act as an exchange, then food is one of the most basic human signals of peace and cooperation. Some early commentators suggested precisely this. By accepting water and returning food, the visitors, if they were visitors, offered a mutual transaction. The gesture mattered more than the recipe. Pancakes are familiar, non-threatening, and edible. The logic runs that handshakes can fail, but food almost always communicates goodwill. Others looked at the nutrition angle. Even a plain pancake provides carbohydrates and proteins, fuel for metabolism. That choice could signal shared biological understanding or at least simple practicality. If the visitors wanted Simontton to consume it without hesitation, offering something resembling a staple of human diets would have been far more effective than presenting an object entirely alien. This interpretive layer emerged precisely because the lab results confirmed the cakes were not inedible or synthetic, they were digestible food. Still, these symbolic readings live alongside the scientific record without merging into it. The challenge is that nothing from 1961's testing can verify intention. What remains is material proof of food that does not align neatly with Simontton's own pantry, embedded in an episode that produced ridicule at the national level. The science proved they were mundane in one sense, earthly grains, but the surrounding circumstances kept the enigma alive. As for 2025, references to reanalysis do exist, though their publication status is unclear. Rumors in ufological forums mention isotope comparisons being run in modern labs, but without cited authors, dates, or institutions, these remain rumors. Unless proper papers or technical memos are provided and verifiable, they cannot be treated as fact. If or when such documents surface, viewers should expect them to be scrutinized closely. Peer review and transparent methodology will be the only way new findings affect the historical record. Anything short of that risks repeating the cycle of speculation that has defined much of the last 60 years. What stands unchallenged is that the Simontton pancakes occupy a rare position in UFO history. They are a preserved artifact tied to an encounter, unlike most cases that dissipate with memory alone. They became both the target of ridicule and the anchor for repeated analysis. Unlike light in a photograph or a radar blip, flour and starch can be weighed, tested, and stored. That fact alone keeps them from fading entirely into folklore. For scientists today, the lesson is humility. Material evidence does not always yield extraordinary results. Sometimes it produces only the data one would expect from earthly origin. Yet the existence of tangible samples ensures that the case cannot be erased entirely through laughter or disbelief. The cakes can still be measured if fragments are made accessible. Whether new science will confirm something anomalous or simply reinforce the FDA and McBain remains to be seen. Until then, what is demonstrably known is exactly what those earlier labs recorded. This brings the puzzle to a different stage. Material evidence attracts not only analysts, but also institutions and individuals forced to decide what to do with it. In 1961, that meant someone had to take responsibility for holding onto these small cakes, forwarding them, and standing publicly in their shadow. In an Eagle River, that role fell first not to a scientist, but to a county judge who suddenly found himself at the center of a story spiraling far beyond his quiet courthouse. The judge, the press, and the cover-up spiral. When Judge Frank W. Carter received one of Joe Simontton's unusual cakes, his actions connected a backyard report to national institutions. On April 21, 1961, Carter formally forwarded a sample to the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, NIKAP, along with a letter documenting the transfer. This moment gave the case a degree of standing far beyond Eagle River. Rather than an odd story circulating between neighbors, a sitting judge placed the artifact into the hands of one of the country's most prominent UFO research groups. It was a procedural move, yet it carried symbolic weight. Legal authority was now intertwined with a farmer's claim. Within weeks, that cautious action began to spiral outward. On May 9, 1961, Richard Hall of NIKAP replied in writing, advising skepticism about the case and stressing the need for documented laboratory analysis before anything was publicized. The group's hesitancy reflected real concern about credibility. UFO advocacy groups were under scrutiny, and tying themselves too closely to alien pancakes risked ridicule. Hall's letter reveals the balancing act: keep the chain of custody moving and gather technical data, but avoid front-page exposure that might discredit the organization. In effect, Carter's attempt to ensure the sample was examined had placed both NIKAP and himself into a storm they could not entirely contain. That storm intensified when news outlets discovered the judge's involvement. Local reporters sensed immediately that the story had mass appeal. A respected county judge forwarding a UFO pancake for scientific analysis was both absurd and irresistible. Newspapers ran with the image of a farmer sharing breakfast with a flying saucer crew, stripping the incident of context while amplifying its comedic edge. Wire services spread it nationally, and soon the words "alien pancakes" appeared in headlines from coast to coast. The nuance of chain of custody and chemical analysis slipped away. What survived publicly was a caricature of Simontton and Carter's roles. The widening press coverage created direct difficulties for Carter. Instead of measured questions about procedure, he was inundated with calls asking for jokes, sound bites, and color commentary. Judges do not typically fend off reporters about extraterrestrial cuisine, yet Carter suddenly found himself doing so daily. He had treated the case as a matter of duty, passing along an object and documenting its receipt. But in the eyes of the public, he had become a participant in an outlandish drama. The pressure left him frustrated. Letters from this period show Carter trying to redirect inquiries toward institutions like the Air Force or NIKAP, but the spotlight refused to leave him. Investigators faced similar pressures. In theory, receiving a physical object from a reported encounter should have invited careful examination. In practice, the cultural environment shaped how scientists and officials responded. Laboratory staff knew that their names, if attached to alien pancake tests, could surface in mocking press clippings. Careers built on technical competence could be jeopardized by association alone. The FDA tested the material and in a memo dated June 8, 1961, issued its results. The cake contained buckwheat hulls, wheat bran, soybean hulls, and starch. This was a sober, professional report. Yet even this dry language risked becoming fuel for cartoons and late-night jokes, leaving the scientists reluctant to comment further. This chain of events formed the basis of what some later described as a cover-up spiral, though the word cover-up may exaggerate intent. The historical record shows a pattern more rooted in embarrassment than in coordinated suppression. Judge Carter responsibly forwarded the sample. NIKAP responded cautiously, emphasizing the need for documentation. The FDA performed a straightforward analysis. But once the press transformed the story into farce, each institution involved stepped back. The ridicule itself discouraged further exploration. What might have been a significant chance to investigate physical evidence instead became a reputational hazard. The sharper irony is that the very factors that should have strengthened the case, official custody, a tangible artifact, laboratory analysis, were the same ones that turned it into an irresistible public spectacle. UFO reports of lights were easily brushed aside. Pancakes, however, were tactile, edible, and inherently comic to the outside world. Once journalists seized that angle, the officials closest to the material began retreating. Their calculations shifted from "what can we learn?" to "how quickly can we move this out of view?" Carter himself testified to the disturbing imbalance. What he had expected to resolve with a few letters became a season of intrusive attention. Correspondence in his files suggests a steady frustration with interruptions and unwanted notoriety. Meanwhile, NIKAP's internal communications show a group alarmed by the risk of ridicule, fearful that one unusual case could undermine their broader work. For the Air Force, the answer was simple expediency: label the case a misunderstanding, file it under hallucination, and move forward. Outwardly, the matter closed. Inwardly, the doubts, debates, and second-guessing remained obscured. Seen in this light, the so-called spiral does not rest on dark conspiracies. It rests instead on the institutional desire to avoid laughter. Embarrassment, more than evidence, shaped the conclusion. A farmer's report escalated to a judge's desk, entered national news, and ricocheted back to laboratories and the Air Force with a joke attached. From that point, serious exploration was nearly impossible. Once an event is framed as comic relief, funding, support, and interest evaporate. The ridicule itself functions as a closing mechanism. For modern researchers, this may be the most telling lesson of Eagle River. Material evidence in UFO studies carries both promise and peril. Handled responsibly, it should ground the debate in facts. Mishandled, it makes scientists, officials, and even judges vulnerable to public ridicule. Simontton pancakes demonstrate how an artifact can attract attention for the wrong reasons. That attention did not yield additional data, only noise. And in the end, the fate of the investigation had less to do with the grains inside the cakes than with the headlines that gave them their nickname. The Eagle River case shows how public framing can steer official response. Scientists who might otherwise have offered careful analysis hesitated to be associated with something mocked in print. Institutions shifted from investigating to sidestepping. A county judge, caught in the middle, watched the story he tried to document become almost unrecognizable. Each step illustrates how quickly credibility can collapse when ridicule dominates public understanding. The broader consequence is that the case slid into obscurity, remembered more for oddity than for the procedural reality. A judge forwarding evidence, a research group advising caution, a federal lab identifying ingredients, and an Air Force consultant noting a witness he judged sincere. Beneath the years of headlines lies that quieter path, now largely buried beneath laughter. This leaves a final question. Was Simontton's experience truly unique, or was it one instance of a larger phenomenon of human contact stories shaped by exchanges of tangible objects? That possibility has drawn much more attention in recent years. Far from being an isolated curiosity, the Eagle River pancakes may signal a recurring motif seen in cases around the world, a puzzle that continues to surface in unexpected ways. Patterns across other encounters. When researchers set Eagle River beside other accounts, Joe Simontton's story stops looking like an isolated curiosity and begins to resemble a category of reports that recur across cultures. The key element, the exchange of a small, everyday item between human and visitor, appears not just in Wisconsin, but in scattered testimonies on multiple continents. Analysts have noted that while the details differ, the structure repeats: an encounter at close range, a nonverbal trade or gift, and an artifact left behind. For specialists cataloging cases, this recognizable framework is what makes Eagle River more than a singular oddity. What emerges is a motif of traded objects. In traditional UFO sightings, distance dominates, a light at altitude, a fast-moving craft filmed fleetingly. By contrast, cases like Simontton's describe moments of personal exchange, a container of water offered and in return a pancake. In other reports, fragments of material, small wafers, or consumables were given or left near the witnesses. These exchanges are not accidents like debris falling. The witnesses consistently describe them as deliberate tokens. The pattern is not about grand technology or violent confrontation, but about modest, handheld items introduced into human custody. Notice the repeating ingredients, small, shared items, nonverbal exchange, and artifacts collected. This is what makes the pancake story fit inside a wider pattern. What matters is not only the physical composition of what was given, but also the ritual quality of the act, the sense that communication took place not through words, but through something tangible and ordinary. Researchers point out that this subset of cases challenges the assumption that UFO events yield only ephemeral traces like radar returns or photographs. Instead, they leave behind material evidence that can be weighed, tested, and in some cases, archived for decades. When placed in this broader frame, Simontton's account acquires new depth. He was not a single farmer fabricating a bizarre tale, but part of an identifiable category where witnesses across different nations, without contact with one another, reported similar interactions. The ordinary pancake therefore joins other small artifacts as a recurring motif, where the exchange itself becomes the focal point. Even skeptics concede that such consistency, across scattered testimonies, calls for acknowledgement. This comparative perspective was not lost on the early theorists. Jacques Vallée, in his influential work The Passport to Magania, argued that modern UFO accounts often echo older folkloric traditions. In folklore, the gentry or fairy-like beings were said to offer food or drink to humans, creating moments of exchange that blurred the boundary between worlds. Vallée and others note parallels between these food exchange contact stories and such folklore, suggesting continuity in how encounters are described across centuries. In this view, Simontton's pancakes are not only a UFO artifact, but part of a much longer lineage of narratives where interaction is expressed through food and small gifts. Interpreting the meaning behind these exchanges invites two main possibilities. One is symbolic, a gesture of goodwill meant to disarm fear. Food, after all, is a universal signal of hospitality. What better way to establish benign intention than to consume something familiar together? The other is functional, deliberate placement of evidence to be collected. In that reading, the artifacts are left precisely so they will be kept, tested, and debated, a means of extending the encounter beyond its fleeting moment. The cakes Simontton received clearly functioned this way. They did not vanish with the craft, but entered legal custody, investigative records, and permanent debate. For skeptics, of course, such comparisons may be coincidences of cultural storytelling. Humans often frame mysteries with narrative tropes, and meals or offerings are primal cultural symbols. Yet coincidence does not erase empirical details. In Eagle River, one cannot dismiss the fact that a pancake existed, measured by labs and filed by the Air Force. Whatever its origin, it physically entered the record. That stubborn presence exemplifies why these exchange cases stand apart. They leave matter behind. They push investigators from speculation into analysis, however uncomfortable or mocking that may be. Seen this way, the ridicule that chased Simontton's account for decades may have obscured its most important function, providing a data point in a chain of repeating events. Where lights in the sky dissolve into memory, these exchanges force tangible confrontation. Analysts, when compiling cases, now treat Eagle River as one among several instances of shared artifacts. By assigning it to a category, rather than erasing it as anomaly, the case acquires relevance to modern comparative research. Critics still invoke cultural contamination, arguing that once one case becomes famous, others may echo its features through imitation. Yet the timeline shows otherwise. Independent testimonies of food-like artifacts arose in different places without connection to Simontton or his notoriety. The French reports of edible wafers, the South American stories of bread-like material, and rural European tales of object exchanges circulated separately, only later gathered by researchers studying patterns. Vallée's cataloging effort provided the connective tissue, demonstrating that these were not isolated inventions but data points in an international scatterplot. From there, the question becomes one of weight. Can multiple testimonies, each with different degrees of evidence, yield a genuine comparative framework? Proponents argue yes, because even in their variations, the encounters emphasize the same three features: intimate proximity, exchanged material, and artifacts that persist beyond the event itself. For empirical science, this remains frustrating because many of the physical samples were lost, degraded, or poorly preserved. Simontton's cakes are rare in that at least fragments endured for laboratory inspection. Yet even absent surviving matter, the consistency of report structures strengthens the argument that such encounters compose a recognizable pattern. By 2025, this evolutionary view of UFO reports situates Eagle River not as absurdity, but as a recognizable template. Congress, defense officials, and independent researchers catalog historical testimonies using structured categories. One such flagged theme, appearing in recent cross-comparison summaries, is traded objects. The decision to label object exchange as a category signals that institutions now regard it as more than folkloric whimsy. It is a motif worthy of being tracked within long-term data sets, and in that catalog, Simontton's case is referenced not for its novelty, but for its alignment. Symbolically, this reframing undermines 60 years of laughter. The pancake ticks the boxes of the repeating motif, usually ordinary in form, handled in a moment of quiet interaction and preserved as evidence after departure. The ridicule of the label alien pancake now sits in contrast to the seriousness of classification within modern UAP studies. This does not mean the object was extraterrestrial, but it does mean that methodical review sees it as part of a broader data field, one case among others sharing the same template. That shift changes the outcome of interpretation. No longer judged only on Simontton's credibility, the case acquires external validation through its parallels. A witness on one continent may seem eccentric. Several across time and geography align into evidence of structure, if not of origin. Patterns across human testimony matter in the same way repeated data points matter in natural science. Whatever the ultimate explanation, the shape of these interactions ceases to look random once documented in comparative perspective. From there, a broader challenge emerges. If some encounters generate artifacts, then those artifacts carry consequences not only for the witnesses but for their environments. What is exchanged may not be limited to what is eaten, held, or stored. It may leave secondary effects whose traces linger long after the objects themselves are gone. Did it kill his chickens? Not long after the saucer supposedly departed Joe Simontton's yard, another part of the story entered the local press. Joe was not just a plumber, he kept chickens on his small farm. And according to a May 3, 1961 article in the Milwaukee Sentinel, Simontton himself reported that several of his birds had become sick, and some had died in the days following the encounter. He even asked the sheriff to notify the Air Force of this development. For some, it sounded like little more than another strange twist in an already strange story. For others, the timing seemed too coincidental to dismiss out of hand. In those early reports, there was no suggestion of thorough investigation. The newspapers relayed Simontton's claim, but neither Project Blue Book nor NIKAP treated the chicken deaths with seriousness. Officials focused instead on the pancakes since they could be bagged and tested. Livestock health fell by the wayside, viewed as anecdotal and unsubstantiated. The idea that poultry illness might be linked to a hovering craft struck many as absurd. Chickens die for many ordinary reasons: disease, feed issues, sudden cold snaps. With no veterinary records, no necropsies, and no systematic logging of deaths, the chickens became a passing detail in the coverage, not a point for data collection. That neglect meant the issue never entered the core case file. While Judge Frank Carter documented the transfer of the pancake to NIKAP on April 21, 1961, and NIKAP's Richard Hall requested clear laboratory documentation in his May 9 letter, none of that attention extended to Joe's animals. Reports of sick birds simply lingered in local rumor and the occasional press item. For skeptics, this was a textbook example of embellishment, colorful but scientifically useless. For those inclined to believe Simontton, the poultry deaths represented a clue abandoned before inquiry could even be attempted. It's important to remember that in 1961, the tools for verifying such claims were limited. Toxicological and environmental testing was not equipped to detect subtle contaminants in soil or animal tissue without specific collection procedures. By the time anyone might have brought laboratory resources to Eagle River, the moment had passed. Even if chickens had died abnormally, no samples were preserved. So the detail drifted into the margins, folklore layered onto an encounter that officialdom preferred to dismiss. From today's perspective, the missed opportunity is clear. Modern science recognizes that livestock health can act as a sensitive indicator of environmental disturbance. Poultry, in particular, are vulnerable to toxins in soil, feed, and water. If anything unusual had been deposited on Simontton's farm, his chickens may have been the first to register its effects. But that line of inquiry was never opened in 1961, and nothing more than Joe's statement to the newspaper survives. It remains an untested lead. The idea that an exotic propulsion system or exhaust might have released harmful byproducts is a possibility researchers sometimes mention now, but it has to be kept squarely in the realm of hypothesis. Without verifiable soil tests from the site, it can't be treated as fact. What can be said with confidence is that Simontton associated his birds' sudden decline with the immediate aftermath of the landing incident, and that he attempted to involve authorities. That historical record comes not from rumor decades later, but from a printed news article naming him as the source. For NIKAP, the citizen research group that briefly handled the pancake sample, the poultry story would have been another data point if only Joe had submitted documentation, veterinary notes, or dates of losses. In their correspondence, they repeatedly asked witnesses to provide supporting material that could stand against skepticism. None seems to have been provided in this case. Without it, the chickens stayed in the shadows. Blue Book files never even mention the matter, a silence that shows how dismissive official channels were of anything beyond the tangible cake. The fact that chicken deaths remained in the background does not make them meaningless. Instead, they highlight how quickly potentially valuable details slip through the cracks. In 2025, when researchers consider how to revisit Eagle River, the poultry issue naturally resurfaces. It serves as an example of what systematic science could examine if the physical site is still accessible. Soil cores could be analyzed for unusual chemical residues. Archived feed samples, if any existed, could be checked for contaminants. None of this has yet been published in formal reports, but the proposal itself, asking whether environmental traces linger, derives directly from that old note in the Milwaukee Sentinel. It is equally valid to emphasize alternative explanations. Chickens can die suddenly from pathogens like Newcastle disease, from parasite burdens, or from abrupt changes in temperature. Rural farmers in the 1960s often faced such problems. That context reinforces why so many dismissed Joe's story of sick birds as coincidence. The absence of preserved records makes it impossible to resolve even now whether the losses were out of the ordinary. For historians, the issue is not proving a direct causal link, but preserving the fact that Simontton himself tied poultry deaths to the aftermath, and that this claim was published contemporaneously. Re-examining this overlooked detail illustrates something larger about UFO cases of the era. Investigators preferred to focus only on the most concrete evidence, a physical object that could be weighed, tasted, or placed under a microscope. Environmental or biological side effects, less easily captured, were often ignored. Today the balance has shifted. With more advanced toxicology and a stronger appreciation for ecosystem markers, past dismissals appear less secure. What 1960s investigators laughed off as just chickens could, in principle, have been the most sensitive instrument at Joe's farm. This makes the chicken deaths less an answer than an open door. They represent unexplored data that could warrant modern follow-up. If researchers ever conduct careful environmental review of Eagle River's soil, one motivation will be this very account. Did anything measurable linger that plausibly connects to the flock's decline? Or does the land sit indistinguishable from any other Wisconsin farm? Without testing, those questions hang unanswered. What is certain is that the claim existed early, was tied by Joe to the encounter itself, and was passed to officials who chose not to act on it. In terms of narrative, the poultry detail also had consequences. By piling a claim of dead chickens atop pancakes from a saucer, the case became even easier to caricature. News readers could scoff not only at extraterrestrial cooking, but also at the mention of mysteriously stricken hens. And because there was no documentation, the ridicule drowned out any scientific impulse. In that sense, the chickens didn't just suffer, so did the credibility of Joe's broader account. Yet with historical distance, that very dismissal looks short-sighted. Today, mentioning the chickens does not add comic excess. Instead, it reminds researchers that some pieces of evidence weren't ridiculous but simply uninvestigated. And in hindsight, those omissions reflect more about institutional discomfort than about the plausibility of the claim. The chickens may never tip the scale from doubt to certainty, but they hold a place in the puzzle precisely because they echo a larger theme. Environmental context matters, and was rarely pursued when it came to UFO reports. Simontton's flock, then, exists in history as an unresolved footnote, a data point left untested. He told a reporter he asked for the sheriff to inform the Air Force. Beyond that, nothing was done. And now, decades later, that lapse itself becomes part of the story. A reminder of how cases get flattened, how nuance is lost, and how an encounter remembered for its pancakes also carried living consequences that never found their way into official files. This unresolved chapter also explains why public attitudes split so sharply. Some saw absurdity, others saw a squandered chance at deeper understanding. The way townspeople, journalists, and institutions responded reflects broader patterns in how culture processes the strange, and those same dynamics carried forward in what happened next. The cultural legacy of a pancake. When conversation about Joe Simontton's encounter spread beyond Eagle River, the reactions fractured quickly. Some openly called it a hoax, others admitted fascination with the strange detail of food left behind, but the loudest voice belonged to ridicule. National syndicates like UPI and AP ran headlines that leaned into the absurd image of a farmer handed pancakes by a flying saucer crew. That editorial choice shaped the cultural afterlife of the case. What began as a local submission of physical evidence was recast almost overnight into one of the most mocked stories in American UFO history. The very ordinariness of the object, a familiar edible pancake, became ammunition for laughter rather than concern. Inside the research community, the tone was cautious but revealing. Letters preserved from NIKAP in early May 1961 show how uneasy even UFO advocates were. Richard Hall, writing on May 9, explicitly advised against publicizing the story, warning that attaching NIKAP to the term alien pancakes would risk ridicule and credibility. Their private doubts contrasted with what the press was amplifying without pause. For NIKAP, the key was not to champion the story, but to quietly document and move it out of the limelight. What surfaced publicly, however, was a case already branded as unsalvageable comedy. Closer to home, Eagle River showed more nuance. Neighbors knew Joe as a tradesman and farmer, not the kind of person who sought attention, and some quietly defended the idea that he would not invent such a tale. But nationally, the mocking shorthand of Simontton's Pancakes smothered that kind of defense. Local boosters eventually realized the only way forward was to embrace the notoriety. In later years, souvenir shops landed in, selling novelty space cakes, and fishing maps and trail guides carried playful nods to the incident. Tourism sites reframed the story less as humiliation than as quirky heritage. By turning the joke into merchandise, townsfolk wrestled some control back from national ridicule and made it their own local folklore. Yet the very ridicule that marginalized the case also guaranteed its survival in memory. Dozens of other 1960s sighting reports quietly slipped into archives, forgotten even by UFO researchers. But the absurd label of alien pancakes was too vivid to lose. Radio hosts recycled it as a standing gag, magazines ranked it in their strangest sightings lists, and within the UFO community the case became a metaphor of risk. By the 1970s, researchers used the phrase, "We don't want another pancake incident," to warn each other about cases that might attract media mockery. Joe Simontton's testimony was thus transformed from one farmer's file into a cultural shorthand. Even if it was dismissed as nonsense, it remained a necessary cautionary tale. The cultural climate today looks very different, with U.S. congressional hearings on unidentified aerial phenomena and Pentagon officials confirming unknown objects on record. Ridicule no longer automatically closes the book on old reports. Scientists and intelligence analysts alike now collect cases with physical traces, however unusual, precisely because these can be revisited. The Simontton Pancakes, once little more than a punchline, suddenly align with modern priorities. They represent a rare example of alleged tangible material exchanged in a close encounter, and that alone makes them relevant. What once seemed comical now sits on the same lists alongside radar contacts, soil traces, and metallic fragments. Even if the pancakes were nothing extraordinary, they function as a data point that can be cataloged in official reviews rather than laughed away. For Eagle River itself, this shift matters. In the 1960s and 1970s, the case was exploited mainly to attract curious outsiders, feeding into local jokes. By 2025, historians and archivists revisit news clippings and letters from Carter and NIKAP to trace how the evidence was handled. Residents now point to the incident not only as a source of humor, but also as a rare connection to one of the strangest chapters in UFO research. Ownership of the narrative has changed again. The town can still smile at its reputation, but can also claim that its folklore sits inside national research files. For a community ridiculed for decades, reframing the story as part of the broader push for UFO transparency brings new meaning. The enduring lesson is that the meaning of evidence depends on cultural context. In 1961, public laughter drowned out details and discouraged deeper inquiry. Today, with officials openly discussing unexplained objects, the very same details find new relevance. Institutions now ask not whether a story sounds silly, but whether it contains tangible material that can be studied. By surviving long enough, the Simontton Pancakes crossed from comedy to case file. They moved from headlines as a joke to archives as an example of trace evidence. Ridicule preserved the memory, and changing attitudes revived its value. For viewers, the takeaway is straightforward. The alien pancake went from a national punchline to a research data point, exactly the kind of turnaround that shows why reopening old files is worth the effort. What was once safe to dismiss now sits flagged in records as one of the only encounters to leave food as alleged evidence. That enduring duality between ridicule and relevance forms the true cultural legacy of Eagle River's most unlikely breakfast. And in considering that legacy, another question emerges. If the case endures today not just as folklore, but as one of the strangest entries in official files, what does that say about its place among the rarest UFO encounters ever recorded? The case of Joe Simontton closes on a set of facts that remain unusual even today. He reported a daylight landing and a direct exchange with 3 short occupants. Judge Frank W. Carter formally forwarded one of the cakes to NIKAP on April 21, 1961. NIKAP's Richard Hall replied on May 9, advising caution but requesting proper documentation. On June 8, the FDA identified buckwheat hulls, wheat bran, starch, and soybean hulls. J. Allen Hynek investigated in person, and Project Blue Book filed the case as hallucination. Meanwhile, local residents like Savino Borgo and the Loretsky family also reported seeing discs. Taken together, these verified points outline a chain of custody and context few UFO cases can match. Internal correspondence reveals unease rather than certainty, and archival interest decades later shows the doubts were never entirely settled. New archival releases and modern lab re-examinations may change how we look at this. Links are in the description. What do you think? Were the pancakes a hoax, an intentional token, or overlooked evidence? Let us know in the comments below. Check the description for the original 1961 source documents, and subscribe if you want to see follow-ups on cases like this.